Hey, what's up? I'm making this cold open because an hour and a half, 2 hours ago, BSG ended up making a tweet saying that they were going to be taking the servers down for maintenance tonight. Well, as of the time of this recording anyway. So that gives you an idea of time frame. This project that I've been working on is about 5 days old. I'm about 30 hours into this video with the research and the tracking of the audio, which was tracked 2 days ago, and the production of the editing in the video and the stuff like that. So if some of this seems like it's just a little bit outdated, it's because the patch happened and there might be some stuff that got changed. However, my belief is, obviously having not seen the patch yet, my belief is 90% of what's in this video is still going to be relevant, because the amount of work that they have in front of them from a labor-intensive standpoint, I think is insurmountable given the time frame that they've had since 0.13 went live. I genuinely believe that. So hopefully you guys end up digging this. Hopefully this sheds some light on things. This is not a hit piece, okay? There's no big complaints or anything. I really think that this is coming from a good place. So hopefully you guys will be able to stick through it. I hope you like it. Thanks for coming by. And yeah, thank you. I love you guys. Thanks. Repeatedly, and without fail, aside from the people that say I'm a cloud-chasing D-bag, anyway, I've been asked what I think about the current state of Tarkov, the community's toxicity, the never-ending debates about audio, game mechanics, and recoil, among other things. For whatever reason, people tend to like when I chime in on things like this, and yet others still, well, don't. And that's okay. I know I'm not everyone's preferred choice, and I know that in the past I've been a bit abrasive. A lot more abrasive than I am now, and if you're someone that I've turned off in the past, I want you to know that I believe I've grown quite a bit as an internet personality, as a content creator, and as a person over the last 5 years or so. And my hope is that you're going to give me another shot. But if you don't, I want you to know that I understand. Before I talk about anything related to the particulars, I want to first say that this is coming from a place of love. Looking into this is not me trying to complain about how bad things are or just gripe for the sake of griping. I try to rail against that as much as possible. No, this is a love letter of sorts to the folks at BSG, and while there are things here that I find to be troubling, I'm not generating this to slag them or to slag you or anyone else. My hope is it will speak to the magnitude of importance that this really desperately needs to be done right. But there is a glimmer of hope. Through this, I'm hoping that I can put to bed some of the rumors about Oculus being a bad audio engine. Through the reading and research that I've done, I've come to the conclusion that it has the potential to be quite good. But it also comes with a small caveat. The engine and its implementation is only going to be as good as its producers using it, much in the way that Ken Block's all-wheel drive Ford Mustang Unicorn is a potentially amazing vehicle, but was made amazing by the man driving it. Rest in peace, you beautiful bastard. That being said, there's a bit of ground to cover here, and while I don't like making ultra-long-form videos and therefore want to keep this one as short and succinct as I possibly can, like I usually do, I want to make sure that the ground here gets covered. My hope is to possibly shed some light on what I think is going on over at BSG with the implementation of Oculus Audio from a consumer perspective, using some information derived from an audio engineer on Reddit, one of my community members, and relying on a little bit of my own testing in the hope that we might develop a bit of an understanding for what BSG is trying to produce. And unfortunately, where I believe they're going to have some trouble. I truly believe that the audio in Tarkov is the worst it has ever been. Some people will make an attempt to argue that the best the audio ever has been was prior to the implementation of Steam Audio. But I can say as an audiophile and someone that has produced a lot of my own audio, musically and otherwise, grew up in a household of audio engineers, that this objectively to me feels to be completely false. The audio in this game being the worst it's ever been is extra troubling for me, because in my opinion, Tarkov is a game that is likely one of the most reliant games on audio quality and direction in history, and possibly the most reliant on audio quality and direction in all FPS games, rivaled only by a game like Hunt Showdown. Although I personally believe there's less risk involved in a game like Hunt than there is in a game like Tarkov. But we can, of course, agree to disagree. Granted, further, there will be people that say it was better before Steam Audio even, before Steam Audio's implementation, and there are some still that even now will say that Oculus Audio right now is better than Steam Audio, at least for them. And that isn't something that I'm going to try to take away from them or from you. But again, objectively speaking, Steam Audio only improved upon an already incredibly flawed audio engine. Veritas did an incredibly in-depth look at the audio systems of Tarkov and proved via several different scientific methods that Steam Audio was and is an improvement to the base audio coding of Tarkov. And it wasn't just an improvement, it was an incredibly large improvement. For this reason, I will say that prior to the implementation of Oculus Audio, the best the audio had ever been in Tarkov was at the end of 12.12. I know that people will disagree, and that's okay. But objectively speaking, even with the flaws the audio system had, there was no more accurate we have ever had audio in Tarkov for this audio engine than Steam Audio's inclusion in the game prior to patch point 13. A few months later, and coupled with a booze-induced boomer rant about removing Steam Audio being a giant mistake, and we have Oculus, which has again been proven to not work as intended, at least not right now. In several of my recent videos, I've referenced other creators, especially my friend Veritas, who did a blind test to see if people could tell the difference between the binaural setting of Oculus being on or off. What he didn't tell us was that for certain questions, he had slipped in some old Steam Audio sounds, all the while asking us if a sound was coming from the front or the back in one particular section. In that particular section, a sound was generated from behind the listener, although he didn't tell us that. The audience was asked to choose between if the sound came from in front or behind. Then the audience, for the Oculus side of this test, was split right down the middle. 50% of the listeners said it was in front, and 50% said it was behind. Basically, no one could tell. This same sound effect, played for the same audience, but this time generated using Steam Audio instead, was answered correctly by those same people 90% of the time, overwhelmingly proving that Steam Audio worked and Oculus Audio did not. At least, not right now. And while there are those among us that will say Oculus Audio is more immersive or that the gunshots sound better, and yet some still will say that they can tell the difference in spatial audio around them better using Oculus, the data in this case doesn't lie. In my own testing, my own personal experience, I can't tell the difference between front and back, and I usually pride myself on this kind of thing. It's kind of what I do. And in regard to immersion compared to that of solid directional audio, I personally wouldn't care, at the moment at least, if the gun sounds came from Roblox or were Star Wars pew-pew laser noises, if it meant that I could tell the difference between front right and rear right. However, I also think that BSG has a bit of a problem on their hands in regard to how this audio engine works and why it's having the issues that it does. In a recent Reddit thread created by the user Enraha, who is a self-proclaimed audio engineer and also a viewer of mine, a frequenter of my stream that goes by the name of J_Wise, they outline how the Oculus audio system has a rather significant flaw, which I unknowingly ended up highlighting in a recent YouTube video that he referenced, where I showed that audio around corners is, well, broken. But we'll reference that in a second. Again, a huge shout out to another community member of mine, Depeche Mode, who clued me into this issue and led me down the testing rabbit hole. Thanks a lot, man. Prior to the Oculus implementation, the audio in Tarkov had been generated using what are called occlusion zones. These zones have borders or zone thresholds, usually typically between like walls of a building, inside to outside. If you were standing outside, for instance, the inside sounds would sound muffled. If you were standing downstairs from another person above you, their footsteps would sound muffled, etc. The transition between these two thresholds, though, was pretty abrupt. You could put your head inside and outside of a door frame and hear the change. But these zones had issues in places like stairwells, especially where the audio was broken up or sounded like it was on the same floor as you, even though they might be 3 or 4 floors up, which made you second guess yourself in terms of where a potential target could or would be. How BSG had encoded this lacked a seemingly simple aspect of what we hear in the real world. When someone walks up to a corner or on the stairs of a stairwell, for instance, we can hear those steps reverberating around the corners or up the stairwell's shaft. If a door is open at the top of a stairwell, we can hear the steps of someone down below through this door, In the real world, this phenomena is what is called audio or sound diffraction.
How'd I hear him?
And this is what the core audio engine of Tarkov primarily lacked with utilizing the first module of Steam Audio. And it also claimed it wasn't getting the support it required from Valve in order to fix it. Due to this lack of support, per Nikita, Steam Audio needed to be scrapped. So out with Steam Audio and in with Oculus, after 2 years of trying. Oculus does have some merit that lends to some simplification, at least on the surface. Those occlusion zones and thresholds that I just mentioned that at one time had to be drawn and defined by the developers no longer needed to be drawn. Instead, Oculus, the way it works is to use the game's geometry to determine whether or not something is considered inside or outside based on the definitions that you give it. And instead of these abrupt threshold transitions, Oculus fades these in and out in a much more natural way. At least, it's supposed to. According to their own documentation, it states the audio propagation feature of the Oculus Audio SDK provides real-time reverb and occlusion simulation based on game geometry. You simply tag the scene mesh, the stuff that polygons that you put in the world are covered in, that you want included in the simulation, and select the acoustic material for each mesh. So you turn it on certain surfaces or not. This means that when the listener moves between indoor and outdoor spaces, the audio transition is graceful, without additional portals or multiple reverb setups. This is all supposed to be done automagically. Again, this is if it's in a perfect world. But right now, the maps in Tarkov don't do this. Even maps where binaural is enabled, they don't have these smooth transition in certain places. There are still operational thresholds for certain types of sounds like footsteps and weather effects.
There's like a hole in the wall back here.
Okay.
And then you just go up the stairs.
And in some places, the audio disappears altogether. You can use Woods Bunkers as a perfect example. And that map, Woods, is supposed to have all of the features of Oculus Audio enabled on it right now.
Got it.
This, I believe, is due to the core nature of Oculus. In its own documentation, at the basic level, the Oculus audio engine cannot accurately map diffraction, that around the corner and up and down stairwells part that we just had a chat about a second ago, again from the Oculus Audio SDK. Sounds interact with a user's environment in many ways. Objects and walls may obstruct, reflect, or propagate a sound through the virtual world. The SDK only supports direct reflections and does not factor in the virtual world geometry. This problem needs to be solved at a higher level than the Oculus Audio SDK due to the requirements of scanning and referencing world geometry. Again, from the SDK documentation. In addition, the audio propagation system models occlusion with a simple line of sight calculation and does not model diffraction. That means that the transition from audible to obstructed can be abrupt and may require some adjustments. Sound familiar?
What the fuck, man?
This could explain the reason why certain aspects of Shoreline, for instance, when around corners or walking in rooms and heading up and down stairs, causes you to lose all sense of hearing of a once audible object moving around on a separate or even the same floor.
Are you walking around right now in Wood? Still?
Yeah, I'm walking on Wood, yeah.
Are you still walking?
Yeah.
What the f? In order to attempt to fix this issue, Oculus has a higher level plugin for the plugin, an audio propagation beta that is generated to try to solve this diffraction problem. but this has its own issues. The way it's intended to work is by telling the game what every surface on the map is made of, which is a part that already kind of had to be done. But the engine then applies a level of absorption, scattering, and sound transmission where it would reflect off of that surface and then head to the next, and so on. But the controls for this are limited. In other words, Oculus Audio is most like, but not exactly like, an audible version of ray tracing, which is referred to as wave tracing. Most notably utilized in games like Squad, Insurgency Sandstorm, and recently, the Callisto Protocol. This is Oculus's intended way to get around its occlusion issues. But as I said, the controls are limited. The way it works is not only by telling the rendered room what each surface is made of, but also telling it how many surfaces are actually going to be involved. And this is where the labor-intensive part comes into play. Imagine for a moment you're standing in a room. If I clap my hands, that sound would bounce off of all of these different surfaces. But when virtually mapping this room in a 3D model, it could be that the hand clap doesn't come out sounding like it's been rendered in an immersive or realistic way, depending on who's listening and from where they're listening to it from. So now I have to tinker with the walls and other surfaces to redefine what they are in terms of how they're heard. It's too echoey. Maybe instead of this wall being made of quote-unquote painted wood, I instead say it's made of carpet. So the sound that's generated loses a lot of its echo faster. If that deadens it too much, perhaps I have to say it's got the sound profile of dirt or grass in order to diffuse it just a little bit more, or gravel, who knows. And this is where the tinkering comes in. BSG would need to, very labor-intensively, map each and every surface or groups of surfaces and map the level of reflectiveness of those surfaces in order to throw more audio out and around corners or up stairwells. Further, they would also need to map and define what are called child surfaces. Think of it like a door frame and a door inside of a concrete wall, for instance, that can have different states, like open and closed. From here, you then have to give it a listen. Is the room or hallway too hot and echoey, or is it not echoey enough? Does the reverberation throughout the room actually make sense? Or should it have more or less? Ever notice when people move in and out of view in most of the places on the maps that they can sometimes sound like they're underwater using the engine right now? That underwater sound is called wetness, or sounding wet. Oculus has a dial for that, but it's one of only two dials. There's a wetness dial, and there's a dial for reverb amount. They don't have the power to adjust like the audio fall-off curves, at least not for this part. They do somewhat in another section, but I'm going to get to that in just a second. The point here is you should be able to see where this starts to become labor-intensive as soon as I put someone in another room and start trying to listen to the sound profiles emanating from different perspectives. But this is how Oculus works, if the SDK documentation is to be believed, and this is the job that BSG has in front of them. This is what they chose to take on. In most places, I'd argue, though, until this point, it hasn't been done very well. There is also one other issue in many of the maps, and that is what's called attenuation. When creating dynamic audio like this, based on distances away from sounds, there are two or more of what are called sound roll-off curves. The idea being that when something is close to you, there's a separate set of audio parameters that are used, as opposed to sounds that are far away. Far away sounds have a lot of reverb and are a lot more bassy. Bass tones travel further distances than high ones, in case you didn't know. Up close, sounds are a lot more crisp and don't usually have any echoing until they get further away or down a hall or around a corner, etc. But in Tarkov right now, there are audio dead zones depending on distances. For example, inside of the Shoreline Resort, at 3 meters or so, the person walking around in this room suddenly went completely silent. My theory here is that I'm no longer in a direct line of sight, and since there's no diffraction being built right now, the sound is completely occluded because I'm no longer in a direct line. However, once I get 8 to 10 meters away, there's this separate audio curve that I enter into at that given distance that begins to emit a separate sound profile with a separate set of audible parameters. So now I can hear them again. If I were to get even further away, I might be too far to hear their footsteps, but I could then hear a gunshot, which would sound significantly different than if I were up close, but is still noise deadened in this in-between zone, the up-close area, because the close-up curve, for whatever reason, isn't being accurately or adequately defined, along with the other aforementioned issues I described about sounds bouncing off of other surfaces, seemingly also not being set up correctly, at least right now. This could also explain the overdriving of audible gain we're hearing at distances now with certain gunshots and grenades going off. They end up reverberating around us sometimes in what seem to be all directions, which makes it a bit harder to pinpoint those directions, even on the maps that BSG have told us are quote-unquote built. Also, I don't know about you, but when I hear words like ray tracing or wave tracing being like ray tracing, I automatically end up thinking costly or resource hog, and you'd be right. In most implementations of audio engines like this, wave tracing is resource intensive. Squad comes to mind, for instance, with this, which has fully implemented binaural audio, which uses wave tracing like this, but the options for the highest quality settings, where things sound the best and is the most accurate, have a massive effect on frame rate due to the extra computational requirements. And well, Tarkov isn't exactly the most resource-light game in the world. And that's kind of where we were when we were dealing with Steam Audio and plugins and CPU costs, right, Nikita? There is one other option potentially, although it seems very, very unlikely, and that is what is called path tracing. A good example of this is the audio engine of R6 Siege, where audio is not only filtered through walls, occlusion, but also around corners, as the programmers draw a direct path around corners from the sound emitter to the sound recipient, modifying the sound based on distance and number of obstructions, walls, etc. in between, rather than having sounds bouncing around a room or down hallways like what wave tracing does. The game's sound emitter finds the nearest recipient and then just draws a path to them. The path followed checks for obstructions and adjusts the audio filtering as appropriate as the recipient moves around. This method is celebrated, and while not as accurate necessarily, is pretty elegant, not nearly as labor-intensive. It typically takes less tweaking than the wave tracing option that Oculus uses, and it costs significantly less resources. However, the downside is Oculus doesn't support path tracing in any way. It doesn't exist. There's no module for it. So if BSG wanted to attempt to utilize this method to save us some frames, they'd have to build a path tracing module from the ground up to be used within Oculus. And this late in the game, that does not seem like a viable option. At this point, it's safe to say that Oculus is implemented on all of the maps, by the way. The core audio functionality is on them. You can hear it, especially given the examples that I've just shown you. What's lacking is the latter parts, defining surfaces and tweaking them so that the audio carries the way it's supposed to. That is, of course, after they actually turn binaural on for everyone on the maps where it's enabled, which we know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, it absolutely isn't. Right? Right, guys? Right? Part of the reason, I believe, why we aren't able to hear things as well as we need to is because the wave tracing option for this audio system, similar to how Insurgency Sandstorm works, doesn't appear to be fully implemented. And in order for it to be fully implemented, not only will surfaces on maps where binaural isn't enabled yet need to also be fully defined, but they also have countless tedious hours tweaking and retweaking the sound transmission necessary for these corners, hallways, windows, doorways, above ground, below ground, and a plethora of other areas, thresholds, rooms, and surfaces. The task here is not insurmountable, but it's going to be a hell of an undertaking rebuilding it all. If the documentation for the SDK is to be believed, I don't think Oculus is a bad choice. In fact, it seems to have all of the tools present to get the job done, and once it's built out correctly, if it can be built out correctly, I think it could be celebrated for what it's capable of. Genuinely celebrated. Could you imagine Tarkov having an award for its sound profile? Imagine. Oculus actually has that capability. It's really just in the hands of the audio engineers, and if they're capable of building it the right way. But that's just it. Judging on what I've read and what others have summarized thus far, if they're going to accomplish this task and accomplish it well, it's going to take a long, long time. Imagine that. The audio engine being the thing that holds them up. This one is going to take some doing, believe it or not. Anyway, guys, that's what I have for this one. Thanks so much to those of you that stuck around, if you did stick around. My name again is Onepeg. You can find me on my socials at OnePegMG on Twitter, at OnePeg on TikTok, As always, I stream daily from 6 to 7 a.m. Eastern until whenever at twitch.tv/Onepeg. And as always, if you would be so kind as to sub the channel here, I would forever be appreciative. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope you guys have a fantastic day. Peace.